Good evening and welcome to day 59. No, excuse me, day 60. We made it to day 60, my 60th video here today. Joined as always by Mr. George Washington, Mr. Abraham Lincoln. And I will start my story tonight with a quote. Two quotes, actually. The first one was, "Is everybody okay?" And the second one is, "Don't lift me." These are the final words of Robert, more popularly known as Bobby Kennedy, as he was just after he was shot from wounds that he would eventually die from in a hotel kitchen in California. So, a little background here on what was going on this June 5th night of 1968. Bobby Kennedy was in California because it was the night of the California primary. He was trying to gain the nomination for president of the Democratic Party. And he had just won actually in California, which is obviously the most populated state in America. So there was a lot of delegates that would be towards him, towards getting the nomination. He also had won South Dakota the same night, and there was certainly a push and a look that Bobby Kennedy might very well be the Democratic nominee. After that night, he was kind of vaulted forward into the favorites position to be the nominee for president of the Democratic Party. After the victory. So he's in California. He's at this the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, and he's giving a speech to. There's the press is there, and then the campaign workers. He's thanking them for their hard work and everything else. And when he's done, he gets, his people start to usher him out. He was originally going to be exiting out through the ballroom area so that he would then meet another smaller group of reporters and ask a few more questions there. But there was a change of plans for some reason, and they decided they're going to skip the reporters, and so they're going to exit him out through the hotel kitchen, which is essentially out through the back. And so they exit him out through the back. As he is going through the kitchen here, it's very crowded. There's people there. A waiter comes to shake his hand, and as he's shaking this waiter's hand, another man from the crowd comes out and fires multiple shots at Bobby Kennedy. I believe 8 shots were fired eventually. 3 of them hit Bobby Kennedy. There are also multiple other people wounded. None of those wounds were fatal. So Bobby Kennedy goes down. He is severely injured. He's got one shot that has struck him in the head. He's got another one that has struck him just under the armpit and has gone into his body here. Anyways, he's got some pretty bad wounds. But he does say, as he lays down there, he looks and turns to the waiter whose hands he was shaking. And he said, "Is everybody okay?" The waiter responds that yes, it appears everybody else is okay. A few minutes later, they move to lift him, to put him on a stretcher, a makeshift stretcher. And he says, "Don't lift me." And then he loses consciousness. He passes out. Those end up being his last words. They do rush him to the hospital, where they are able to eventually get a heartbeat back. They're kind of getting back to life here, and his wife is even there. His wife was was present when all this was going on. Sadly, his wife was also 3 months pregnant at the time. As they go to the hospital, they get the heartbeat back. His wife is there. She hears the heartbeat. There is some hope that maybe he will pull through here. But 26 hours later, his condition just continuing to worsen and worsen. Bobby Kennedy does lose his battle, and he becomes the second of the Kennedy brothers to be assassinated. His brother, of course, John F. Kennedy, assassinated in November of 1963. So, a little less than 5 years later, he is also assassinated. The assassin was a man by the name of Sirhan Sirhan, who was a Palestinian national here in the United States. And his reason for doing it was basically he had read in a newspaper that Bobby Kennedy was pro-Israel. And Israel and Palestine, of course, are a long-running feud over land rights in the Middle East. And he became enraged when they raided his home afterwards, his apartment afterwards. They found his diary, and in his diary, multiple places, it was, "I must kill RFK, RFK must die, RFK must be assassinated." He had become obsessed with this idea of killing Robert Kennedy. And it was he had that newspaper article that talked about Robert Kennedy's pro-Israel stance. They had that in his he had that in his pocket actually on the when he assassinated Kennedy that night. So he is obviously arrested. There was actually quite a struggle. He's punched in the face. He's tackled to the ground. He actually gets away and gets his gun back and tries to shoot more, but the gun it had only 8 bullets in it, and it shot him all already. So he was not able to do that. And then they tackled him again, and obviously he's taken into custody. Where again he says in custody under questioning that this is why, because of Robert Kennedy's pro-Israel stance. Which is why he was going to kill him. The defense that they try to make is that he's essentially insane. Using some of that diary, like his obsession with killing Robert Kennedy, etc. The jury decides that he is not insane, and he is sentenced to death. However, in 1972, California abolishes the death penalty and makes it retroactive to anybody who is on death row. So his death sentence is commuted to life in prison, and he has been denied parole 15 times since then. It's my understanding that he is still alive. That's a little bit about Sirhan. So what about the aftermath of this? What impact did this all have? Well, it had a pretty big impact when you think about it. This was the third assassination in the last 5 years of a major figure. John F. Kennedy in 1963, Martin Luther King earlier in 1968, and now Bobby Kennedy later in 1968. And there was a sense amongst a lot of Americans that there was this they, and I mean, I've heard this expressed in oral interviews where people would say, they did it again, they got him, that there was some they that was out there that was conspiring to take out sort of these younger liberal leaders that were trying to take the country maybe in a little bit different direction. And so there was this sort of despondency. There was also a pretty big despondency among African American communities, both with those three being assassinated. I mean, John F. Kennedy was one of the first presidents to vocally push for civil rights. And then you have Bobby Kennedy, who was also pushing for civil rights, and of course Martin Luther King, whose whole life was about civil rights. And with the death of those three, it sure seemed like maybe the death of the civil rights movement and the death of like there was sort of almost a feeling of, and I'm not saying there was, but there was this feeling of this conspiracy to eliminate people who were trying to push for civil rights, etc. So anyhow. So a lot of African Americans felt this even harder as well. There was also the idea that Bobby Kennedy was on big part of his platform was to get out of the Vietnam War, basically, soon after being elected, quickly as it could be done safely to get out of the Vietnam War. That he had determined, amongst a lot of other people, that this was not a war worth fighting, and maybe not a war we could win, and that he was going to remove U.S. troops from Vietnam as soon as possible. So he was running on that platform as well. So when he dies, that idea sort of dies out with him, because Hubert Humphrey, who was the current vice president under Lyndon Johnson, ends up getting the nomination, and he is seen by most people as basically just the status quo, and that is for a lot of people is unacceptable. LBJ by that point was pretty unpopular, and people saw Hubert Humphrey as an extension of Lyndon Johnson, and that was not going to be good, and so Richard Nixon won in 1968 in a pretty big landslide. Of course, we'll never know if there had been a Bobby Kennedy versus Richard Nixon election, what would have happened. But of course, a lot of people like to surmise that maybe had Bobby Kennedy not been killed, there never would have been a Richard Nixon presidency, which means maybe we would have gotten out of Vietnam earlier, because with Nixon, it took about 3 years before we finally got out of Vietnam. And then you have Watergate and the other things that happened with Nixon being the president as well. So there was a lot of that out there, with the killing of Bobby Kennedy. You could certainly make the argument, and I don't think it's even far-fetched. I think maybe it's accurate that very potentially the death of Bobby Kennedy, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, was more impactful than the assassination of his brother, President John F. Kennedy. So obviously that's just a matter of opinion, but I don't think that's a far-fetched argument by any means. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the story tonight. The Bobby Kennedy, former Attorney General under his brother, senator from New York, presidential candidate in 1968, and his unfortunate assassination. So have a good evening, and we'll see you back tomorrow for day 61. If you have Sunday questions, I'd love to see some. We'll talk to you then. Bye.